Hello everyone, my name is Ian Garcia, this is Devotional Criticism, and welcome back to the New Movie Diary. This is a cinema criticism series in which I review recent, new, and up-and-coming film releases and attempt to give you the straight facts about them in my humble opinion. And because we still don't live in a better world for us all, I am once again coming to you with a special monthly-themed Black Film History Month episode of the New Movie Diary, in a context where all the money in Hollywood is apparently better spent on which of the cash-poor mega-conglomerates is going to shunt the other than on black film, whether films catered to a black audience or just, films where black people got some shine or something, just something. Anyway, that means that I'm going to have to once again inhabit the role of a deeply out-of-pocket, irresponsible white guy and try my best to tailor the New Movie Diary to the contemporary appreciation of black film history, both in front of and behind the camera. And it's just pretty much like I tried telling you guys with Oscar Shaw, the pretty dang good but also incredibly right-wing B crime thriller that I used to open this Black Film History Month. It means that if I want to keep doing this, I'm going to have to raid the giant big box store barrel of discount DVDs and Blu-rays that is the modern direct-to-V.O.D streaming marketplace, with the first half of a double feature of direct-to-V.O.D releases that I programmed for myself last Friday being Lazarus: The Awakening, a rare example of a specific substrata of direct-to-video B cinema, a B vigilante superhero movie directed by Season B action director and stunt choreographer Art Camacho. This film stars Sean Riggs as the eponymous Ray Lazarus, a yoked-out, all-black-clad street avenger brought back from the dead to declare a silent one-man war on what else? The fentanyl trade in Jackson, Mississippi. Some brief IMDb sleuthing on my part revealed that Lazarus: The Awakening is either a spiritual sequel or a reboot of some kind to another B vigilante superhero movie that Riggs had produced and starred in all the way back in 2021, that one simply titled Lazarus. And I don't know what happened in the intervening 5 years that Riggs is dipping back into this character he effectively originated, but with seemingly none of the original creative or production personnel from the first film. But I'll give myself the breathing room to conjecture wildly that it has something to do with the fact that Sean Riggs is a terrible actor. At how, even if we're allowing for the kind of dumb oratory dialogue prose that is part of the course for a thinly written B-actions schlock like this, he is clearly ill-suited to embodying his own character with anything approaching confidence or mystique, and I want to make it clear, none of the other principal cast in Lazarus: The Awakening, right down to even a lot of the lower-level henchmen of the drug kingpin Lazarus is opposing, none of them give a poor turn with the flimsy material they're given, with the biggest laurels being owed to leading lady Courtney Grace as basically the budget Lois Lane of this yarn. Her composure when having to go one-on-one with Riggs is as remarkable as Bud Abbott being able to play a straight man to Lou Costello, though by the end of the gratuitous double climax, even she seems to be just barely able to prevent herself from cracking up in Riggs's face. Those tears of yearning as they have their final meeting before he rides off into the sunset are clearly tinged by the fact that Grace is being brought to tears because Riggs himself is just so goddamned cluelessly funny when spouting this nonsensical dialogue that he wrote for himself. Like, he writes this character and performs this character like exactly the way you would think Dermot would in The Venture Brothers. Which is all to say that Lazarus: The Awakening is a pretty dang funny watch, if you have as refined a sense of bad taste as I do. I adore the sort of movie like this that on the one hand needs to play into the routine action flick fiction of exponentially rising violent crime and gang activity that has no real bearing on the reality of poverty or crime as it's most reflected in the United States, but on the other hand is clearly such a shoestring affair that they say clearly opt to shoot major fight scenes in this gritty urban saga against the location backdrop of what is clearly just the vague suburban consumer parking sprawl of Jackson, Mississippi, the way it actually is, with tons of regular traffic. Yes, even as he's riding off into the sunset, he is very clearly going very safely under the speed limit in a 25 zone in a part of Jackson that clearly has a lot of morning commuter and kid drop-off at school traffic. They either couldn't afford or just couldn't logistically block off the traffic while they were shooting, so that just the quaint reality of even the clearly less affluent parts of Jackson they shoot some parts of this production in just kind of goes on around them. It's like watching a bunch of adults, most of whom are actually giving convincing enough line readings of this purely oratory boilerplate gangster dialogue, just kind of clowning around like kids in their own hermetic fantasy world. And of course, the fact that a lot of the ensemble are generally delivering solid adult performances of this really juvenile script only kind of accentuates the absurdity of what they're doing, how you just can't ignore that the narrative content of the film is so divorced from the actual signifiers of the mise en scène. What the scenery around these characters says far more loudly than any cliche oratory action line. That disjuncture between intention and execution simply becomes part of the movie and what's even passably enjoyable about it. Yes, for anybody with a refined sense of bad taste, that becomes a mild diverting feature, not a bug. I've seen plenty of better budgeted, better staffed, better cast B action romps put out by major studios that, because they had all the essential materials at their disposal and the institutional experience to execute it efficiently, the product is simply mediocre and therefore not nearly as entertaining as like Riggs stomping around in a sleeveless black hoodie and clearly having such a shallow confidence about even his basic gifts as a well-trained martial artist and a well-honed physique on its own, that essential profile he needs to cut as an action star these days. He does this thing where he inexplicably hunches to look intimidating, except that even in his wildest dreams, this character he created wouldn't think to look intimidating. He would just be mysterious and intimidating. You didn't see Michael Jai White doing any of that shit in Spawn. You know, they explicitly compare Lazarus to Blade in the script for this movie, but Blade wouldn't walk around with his head arched down like this so that instead of looking like this imposing force of moral heroism, he instead looks like a puppet being dragged around by invisible hooks stuck into his trap muscles. I'm not gonna lie to you and say that Lazarus the Awakening is even particularly exceptional as a so bad it's good film. I don't even really care for the so bad it's good framework. I'm just being honest that I tend to find that sort of paracinematic relationship of low-rent trash like this far more intrinsically entertaining than whatever this would have looked like if it was better funded, if it was more competently produced, if it wasn't clearly the brainchild of a nice enough seeming but sublimated egomaniac who already tried doing this character once and possibly because of his own blindness to his vacuum of true confidence or talent is going to end up alienating everybody who he worked with on this production with, just like the last time, try to reboot Lazarus again in another 5 years. Again, that's all baseless conjecture, but it is fun baseless conjecture, and this, again, for me, is just part of the far more entertaining paracinematic joy of slop like this. Its discordance within itself is not just an opportunity to laugh at it, it's to take so-called bad art and find ways in which even bad art has the capacity to teach us something about characters, about human nature, about the illusions we subscribe to in spite of all contrary evidence. Merely the ability as an actor to take a production like this seriously with all of the clear clear contradictions to what you're ostensibly trying to achieve going on all around you. You just being Courtney Grace, giving it your all while you know that just across the street, a packed Latin cuisine pickup spot, everybody in there is just watching you and a bunch of other adults play this absurd game of pretend. Truly bad art is like a grand experiment in the confirmation bias and conspiracy of silence, how far people are willing to go to keep the most ramshackle bullshit together just to make a paycheck. It's not as much of a hidden gem as Oscar Shaw, but graded on the curve I usually give to direct-to-VOD films. Again, if you understand that I am not looking for effective technical mediocrity, but something that rewards a refined sense of bad taste, a way of looking at the world and human nature and all of its absurdities through bad art, I'm gonna give Lazarus the Awakening what is, I think, a solid rating of 2.5 out of 5. With that all out of the way, though, I think I'd much rather move on to the second half of this direct-to-VOD double feature, Last Ride, a survival drama that stars young actors Roman Griffin Davis, Felix Jameson, and Charlie Price as a trio of Brooklynite friends who, after scurrying away from their two canoodling parents while on vacation in Norway during the winter break of 1982, end up stranded on a mountain cable car alone in the aftermath of a rare electromagnetic storm. Now, you may be asking yourself, Ian, what the fuck does a movie about 3 white boys trapped on a mountain cable car in Norway have to do with black film history? To which I'll simply plead that sitting here in New Jersey at the start of this work week, as far as I can see, this might be the whitest Black History Month we've had in a while. I'm just kidding. You see, Last Ride, though a really quite obscure international co-production starring 3 young white actors, where the only actor of color appears in the framing of the narrative, the story is told in a long flashback bookended by the present day, this is still a film written and directed by a black Brooklyn-born writer-director, that being Cinque Lee, and is co-financed by 40 Acres and a Mule, the production company founded and owned by Spike Lee, and yes, he and Cinque are siblings, Cinque appearing as an actor in several of his films, as well as being a writer-director in his own right, having already made 4 of his own feature films before this one, though the only one you'll be able to find online in VOD format is going to be Window on Your Present from 2010. And obscurity is certainly a theme that would seem to continue to haunt Lee's own career even up to this point, with what is, I must say, a fairly good movie that, while sporting more than a few warts, we're not fully into fake movie territory, but that sort of fake movie creep that's infesting a lot of low-budget, non-boutique cinema these days is certainly evident here. But it still has a lot of surprisingly subtle and effective attributes to recommend it. It's the sort of movie where the very evidently disappointed ambition of trying to do a picture like this on a clearly limited scale never fully subtracts from its ability to maintain our attention and actually to kind of use that limited scale to more provocatively color outside the lines of the typical survival film. To find small ways that build up over the course of the film that takes the story itself in atypical directions and engenders a truly original sense of atmosphere. Where the point of our attention, the emotional anchor of this journey, is increasingly not if and how these youngsters will survive, but rather that quality of total lack of knowing, that it isn't simply that these kids have no control over their situation, it's that there is this persistent shared dramatic irony between their gaze and the extent to which Lee traps his audience as well, not giving us clear or unambiguous explanations of what is going on. And to a degree where you're both fascinated but also uncomfortable and unsure if there might even be a science fiction or fantasy element to what's going on that isn't just a product of these kids' imaginations or increasingly their deprivation as the the hours tick by and they just get colder and hungrier and more sleep deprived. Last Ride was completed all the way back in 2023, though its original title back then was A Rare Grand Alignment, and I'm not sure if it was distributor Quiver Distribution that forced the title change, or if in the intervening years Lee simply decided it would be easier to shop this thing around if it had a title more akin to a generic survival drama and, didn't make it sound like it was some interminable road movie / romance about 20-somethings whose only character is the pop culture they like, that sort of shit. But whatever the case may be, it doesn't seem to have occurred to anybody that there was already a film called Last Ride from 2009, that film is already all over the VOD marketplaces and is the first and only recommendation when you Google Last Ride movie or Last Ride film. Even websites that review the new movie, if they have links to where it can be streamed, those streaming links will take you to the 2009 Last Ride, whereas Cinque Lee's new film is only accessible on Fandango's website. Well up to the time I was even writing this review, Quiver Distribution did not even have any publicity for Last Ride on its own website. Which is an incredible shame given that it's easily one of the better pickups that I've seen them distribute. Even before I knew it was a film written and directed by a Black American, it was certainly among the most promising looking new releases they've put out in just the last 2 months. It's just not a very high bar to clear, and yet even the distributor itself seems to have basically been holding on to this thing so long that they've decided to practically bury it. Look, is this a tragedy? Is Last Ride essential early 2026 cinema? Well, no, aside from the 3 principals being really miscast, 2 of them are Brits, and no shade on them, but they clearly didn't have the time or technique down to be able to sustain a consistent Brooklyn accent. Poor Charlie Price even seems to have opted for some kind of Finnish accent, maybe trying to imply that he and his mom are European immigrants. Anyway, I would not go so far as to scold their performances overall, but that's just one of those strange, unintentional, borderline fake movie qualities of Last Ride that already establishes that kind of wonky, uncanny feel of a low-budget production being stretched too thin before Lee himself actually attempts to do intentional blurring of the lines between reality and fantasy. Though there is location photography, much of Last Ride was achieved using a volume studio. No doubt many of you have seen this technology extensively employed and advertised by Disney for their various Star Wars TV series. Francis Ford Coppola also recently attempted to exploit the same technology for a more mixed artistic effect with Megalopolis. And effectively what that allows these filmmakers to do, again on a much more limited scale, is to shoot on digital cameras in real time on a fixed soundstage where the set environment is generated and projected 360 degrees, almost completely digital. It's incredibly nifty technology, and I would never go so far as to say that it was totally unconvincing, but I think a low-budget affair like this is really more of an echo of the common myth that big tech companies and major multimedia conglomerates promote as the liberating, democratizing potential of new technology, that when it's in their hands, it really only serves to, ironically, in classic Hollywood accounting terms, for these studio assets to charge themselves more for the use of this novel technology, while also increasingly tightening the actual labor pool that it takes to achieve something. Whereas for a low-budget filmmaker like Cinque Lee, the exact sort of person this technology could ostensibly liberate, where he even does have ambitions that go beyond strict psychological realism, it simply becomes obvious at a certain point that this technology doesn't fit to scale any more than digital cameras or editing software did, and if anything, the use of these technologies outside of more typical Hollywood fantasy slop simply underscores the uncanny unreality of using the technology at all. We are too too constantly aware that this is just a set on a soundstage with extensive visual effects compositing. There's still no indexicality to the image that makes it feel wholly credible, which doesn't matter that much as these boys start to starve and lose it, but does matter quite a bit when, you're just trying to show 3 kids stuck on a cable car in midair. And of course, as with anything, the other technical limitations around this production just compound upon Lee's leaning too much on this novel technology that was only advertised, but never intended for low-budget independence of his ken. There are several moments throughout, especially the first half hour of Last Ride, where you can very much see Lee and editor Lika Hess having to cut around the fact that they simply didn't have enough footage of a moment or an action on coverage. If I could boil it all down to anything, it's that it appears that, again, largely within the first half hour to first half of this movie, Lee is stuck between an overestimation of the latitude that this technology affords him and thus gets a little too comfortable directing his young actors to behave naturally. To not act for the camera, but to try to behave as if they're just a bunch of foul-mouthed latchkey kids who interrupt and mock and cut each other off all the time like nobody, especially their parents, are watching or listening. It's a rough road waiting for that attempt at naturalism to really pay off, which is, coincidentally, also about the part where the suggestive science fiction or fantasy elements of the narrative start to conform to the uncanny unreality of this obviously artificial volume set. It's there that that sustained sense of naturalism in these boys' performances starts to finally complement and gel with the more uncanny visual realization of the story and give us that strong foundation of atmosphere that needs to be there because, there's certainly no foundation to that volume set. It's not just the cable car in story. The movie itself feels suspended in its own contradictory creative pursuits for much of it that I would understand someone just tuning out of it, or maybe a certain distributor just looking at it and saying, look, some shit like Lazarus the Awakening, we can sell that crap in our sleep. People love that sort of trash, but unfortunately, you kind of actually made a good movie, but it's a good movie that has no audience. Tech fatty, atmospheric survival dramas on this scale aren't really a thing. Look, there are so many times on movie social media or movie fan social media where people are constantly brushing up against really facing the hard reality of systemic racism and how that affects not just black film, but just, again, a contemporary and ongoing understanding of black film history, of just the potential of black artists in film, not just in the US, but internationally. We're still stuck at the point where a clearly talented and ambitious black filmmaker who has been working since the f***ing 80s can't even make, literally from gestation, a movie that is not a black film in scare quotes. He can't just make a movie based around a personal creative passion that has nothing to do with his racial identity and everything to do with his identity as an artist. He can't even get some appreciation from the distributor who bought his movie and stands to make the actual mint on it. Last Ride, only a 3 out of 5 for me, but as far as I'm concerned, a surprising, at times even strangely beautiful, welcome inclusion into the canon of black film history, because sometimes it's just black filmmakers making movies, not just filmmakers making black movies. With that, I'm getting out of here. Thank you so much for sticking through this whole video, and please don't be a stranger to shouting out in the comments. What did I get right? What did I get wrong? Otherwise, please share, like, subscribe, bell, yada yada. My name is Ian Garcia. This is Devotional Criticism, and this was the New Movie Diary. I'm going to catch you guys next time.